All right, recording in progress. Great. So today is going to be a little bit more informal, obviously, because we're doing this from my home office. Welcome to my house. We have a guest sitting in on today's lecture. Say hi, Meme. Hey, buddy. That's usually where she sits when I'm in here. So she'll just be back there hanging out. The cat may also make an appearance at some point, but today we are going to talk first. We're going to talk about your test for like 2 seconds. So if you want to look at, okay, that's not important, go away. You go to your course, you guys are section 21. So we can go to tests. There's your test. I'm not going to take it because I'm the teacher and I don't have to. That is, again, due Sunday night, 11:59, along with all of your learning curves, which are, hold on. Yeah, I had to open the right window. Didn't want to accidentally open Twitter. Tough. I'm going to my learning curves. Assignments, yes, okay. Those are all right here. So all of my chapter 1 activities are going to be due, as well as all of my chapter 2 activities. So there's 8 in total. They don't take that long, and they're for completion as well. So just, and they cover stuff that we've talked about. So I don't think if you're behind, it shouldn't take too long to get done with, but that is all due on Sunday night. Now we are going to go over some of what we learned on Tuesday, and then also we're going to press on into operant conditioning as well, talk about punishment and reward and all that good stuff. So just to go over, we started with classical conditioning, talking about Pavlov's dogs. You know, those are the famous experiment. Russian scientist, makes him sound a lot more like movie villainy than he actually was. But Pavlov, so he was initially studying digestion. He wanted to study human digestion, but studied dogs because he could do more experiments on dogs than he could on humans. Because as I think I mentioned on Tuesday, like he had like surgical implants in the jaw of the dog, which obviously with the human participant would be a lot more problematic. Still not great with dogs. This experiment probably wouldn't be carried out today. But we did learn quite a lot from it. So what we figured out was that the dogs would receive an unconditioned stimulus, like it says here. So you'd have a dog smell food, in this case either meat or meat powder. They start to they would salivate. But initially they would have what we call a neutral stimulus, which would be the buzzer in this case. But over time, repeated pairing of those two things, the unconditioned stimulus, the food, and the neutral stimulus, the buzzer, the dogs began to connect those two ideas so that when the buzzer sounded, they would start to salivate with or without the food. So that's the basic idea behind classical conditioning, making associations through repeated exposures to stimuli. It says here, as a learning process in which two stimuli become associated with each other. So an originally neutral stimulus, so something that wouldn't mean anything to that animal or human, is conditioned to elicit an involuntary response. A neutral stimulus can be pretty much anything. So for instance, if I were like, Meme, jump up and down, she doesn't know what that means. So she's just gonna stay and see where she is, because she doesn't know that command. She has not learned to associate that with a particular behavior, and we have not operantly conditioned her to perform that behavior. So she's just gonna stay passed out for the time being. Now, if we did want to teach her how to jump up and down, she would go through this initial phase called acquisition, where she would start to learn to pair those two things together, my words and her actions. That is the initial phase of learning. So there's 4 main terms to learn here with classical conditioning. You have the unconditioned stimulus, which triggers an involuntary response without any learning needed. So I don't need to learn to pull my hand away from something that's hot. I do it automatically. That stimulus is unconditioned. Unconditioned response is that involuntary response. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the unconditioned stimulus would have been the reaction to, or the meat itself would have been the unconditioned stimulus. And then the unconditioned response would have been their desire for the food and that presenting as saliva. Conditioned stimulus, on the other hand, is something that was previously neutral, like a buzzer going off or a light or a verbal command that an organism learns to associate with an unconditioned stimulus. So over time, you would learn to associate a word with the particular feeling, which would become the conditioned response. So in the case of Pavlov, the conditioned stimulus would have been the buzzer, and the conditioned response would have also been to for the dogs to start salivating. So in this case, the conditioned and unconditioned response are the same, but the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are different. So the conditioned stimulus is always going to be something that is introduced. So it's not, like I said, the unconditioned stimulus and response are both sort of naturally occurring, whereas the conditioned stimulus has to be sort of the new factor in the equation, and that starts off as a neutral stimulus. We're going to say the word stimulus a lot in the next couple of weeks. So we talked about the optics example. I want you to pay attention to the McDonald's one. So we start off with just the sight of the golden arches, which in and of itself doesn't really mean anything in terms of your response. But if you were to smell McDonald's fries, your stomach would growl. That would be an unconditioned stimulus, the fries. And then your unconditioned response would be to have your stomach growl because they're delicious and your body wants them. Over time, though, and this is how we'll talk about how advertisers sort of hijack this part of your brain, but your brain will associate, the sight of the McDonald's logo with the fries, and then that will create that same unconditioned response, your stomach growling. Do that enough times, eventually your brain will just cut out the middleman and go straight from seeing the McDonald's logo to your stomach growling. Okay, so stimulus generalization. This is the idea that it doesn't have to be the exact stimulus. It can be something that is pretty close to it, and your brain will make that connection. The example here is Pavlov's dogs could salivate to a metronome, which kind of sounds like a buzzer, but then also we found that there was an acceptable range where, there was that, like it says here, that discrepancy between 80 and 100 beats per minute. They would still have the same conditioned response to it. But eventually, if you got outside of that range through a process called stimulus discrimination, the dogs would be able to differentiate between the conditioned stimulus and other stimuli. So if you had a metronome playing at 40 beats per minute, the dog would not start to salivate because it would not have made that association yet. So, and also like it says here, dogs would salivate to a high pitched tone, but not a low pitched tone because their brains would have discriminated those two different stimuli. Now, those associations can go away after a period of time. This is a process that we call extinction, in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus from the conditioned stimulus. It eventually will stop making that connection, but it doesn't go away permanently. I feel like the term extinction is kind of a misnomer because, like, if a species goes extinct, that is permanent. But there's a process, like it says here, called spontaneous recovery, where that conditioned response will occur again because of that conditioned stimulus, and because your brain doesn't really forget those connections, it just suppresses them, and then it could pop up all over again. So let's say when you were a kid, you ate at McDonald's a lot. So just to go back to the example we used a second ago, and you connected seeing the McDonald's logo with eating their fries, think about going and getting a Happy Meal with your family, that kind of situation. And so, like, back in the day, seeing those golden arches would have made your stomach rumble. But let's say after a period of time, you don't go to McDonald's as much, whatever. But all of a sudden one day you're driving down the road and you see the golden arches and sort of out of nowhere, your brain remembers that connection and your stomach starts to growl. That's what we call spontaneous recovery. So that conditioned response wasn't forgotten. It didn't go away permanently. It was just suppressed during that extinction phase. Okay, so the higher order conditioning is just adding an additional stimulus layer to that. So you have the conditioned stimulus, in this case would be the buzzer for the dogs to start salivating, but they also did an experiment to where they added a light as well. So you're adding a second neutral stimulus to the equation, and that will also become a conditioned stimulus as you add things. And different organisms do this better than others. So like dogs can figure it out pretty well, but if you had like a squirrel, wouldn't think that they would be able to do that higher order conditioning phase quite as well. All right, so this is a case study of poor little Gavin, the ATF dog. So he went to Iraq. We talked about on Tuesday, he became afraid of like loud popping noises that he associated with like artillery fire. So when he came back to the US, he was very nervous and would often get kind of spooked by just normal sounds from around the house, like microwaves, garage doors, things like that. And so the idea here is that Cesar Millan, this guy over here, a very famous dog trainer, that he was going to decondition and then recondition Gavin to stop being afraid of those everyday sounds. And he did this by positively associating different things. So like we talked about on Tuesday, he would let the dog run on the treadmill, which he really enjoyed. And then as he was doing that activity that he liked, he would play, loud popping noises so that the dog slowly but surely would uncouple the loud popping noises from unpleasant memories or unpleasant associations and start to form more positive associations. He would use this in a couple of different neutral stimuli, a couple of different ways. The dog would also, he'd feed him carrots, which were his favorite food, for the exact same purpose. He was trying to get the dog to make a positive association between those noises and things that he liked, and then hopefully to rehabilitate him. So, and very similar to the way that a lot of therapists work with human subjects. So in psychology and in counseling and therapy, there's a school called cognitive behavioral therapy, and they use this kind of technique quite a lot. So let's say you have a client who is socially anxious and gets very freaked out by, going to public places or, ordering food at a restaurant. So a cognitive behavioral therapist will go along with that person as they order. And the idea there is that, having the support mechanism there and then having some positive reinforcement, positive association as they do something that they don't enjoy will help give them more confidence and sort of, like I said, eliminate those negative associations. So conditioned taste aversion, we talked about that on Tuesday. This is the idea where an organism will adapt the ability for things to taste bad. So especially if they're poisonous. So it's, like I said, it's a powerful form of classical conditioning. As an organism learns to associate the taste of a particular food or drink with illness. Okay. So what is your experience with the conditioned taste aversion? So I'm over 21, so I've had alcohol. Alcohol doesn't taste that good. It's an acquired taste, and there's a reason for that. It's because you're drinking poison. Now there is your brain also can override this to some extent. So yes, like your brain is making you aware that this probably isn't great for you, but it's also your brain is powerful enough to kind of subvert that and be like, well, I think the benefits outweigh the cost. Like I said, I'm 21, so I can say these things. If you're under 21, don't drink. But that is a form of conditioned taste aversion. It does have adaptive value because you obviously don't want to eat or drink something that might kill you or make you sick. A good example of that, Garcia's rats would be one. And then also the goannas in Australia. They started eating this invasive species of toad, the cane toad. But what they realized pretty quickly is that the cane toads were poisonous. And so they were killing a lot of these goannas and threatening to go on a population, which, anytime you're disrupting an ecosystem to that extent, it's going to cause some problems. So what they did was they used conditioned taste aversion to help the goannas to understand that these things were poisonous. So they would feed them baby toads, which still made them sick, but didn't kill them, so that they would learn that those toads were not good for them to eat. Sounds kind of morbid, but they did learn to avoid eating the toads that way, and everybody was happy. Right, so I don't think we got to little Albert on Tuesday, which I think part of that was me just repressing it because it's a very sad story. It was a very unethical experiment done by our boy John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner. They experimented on this 11-month-old kid. And so what they did was the poor guy, the baby was put in this little, experiment with a rat. They started with the rat and they expanded it out later using stimulus generalization to other small white creatures. But initially the baby was like, oh, heck yeah, a rat. I'm going to try and pet it. But what they did was they wanted to see if, conditioning could influence emotion. And so they paired a very loud noise. I think it was like something on this, like a steel rod or something, but very, very loud, very unpleasant noise for this little 11-month-old's ears every time that the kid tried to touch the rat. So eventually the kid became very afraid of the rat. So like you can see him here in the picture, obviously pretty freaked out, pretty distressed. There's a lot of conflict. Your book talks about this a little bit, but there's a lot of conflicting information on what actually happened to this kid after the experiment. Some say that he died of probably unrelated brain disorder. Others say that he lived a happy life and, this didn't have too much of an adverse effect on him. But regardless of that, there were some significant ethical implications of terrorizing a baby for the sake of understanding psychology. So that's more what this experiment is known for. Yes, there's a lot of implications that you can take away from classical conditioning, like how effectively you can associate something, a neutral stimulus like a rat with a terrifying noise. So you see that this is a very powerful tool, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be carried out in this way. All right, so this is a good critical thinking exercise and will probably be our discussion board question for next week. So I talked a little bit earlier about how marketers use these classical conditioning ideas and methods in their marketing. And the idea here is that advertisements, like it says here, can instill emotions and attitudes toward product brands that last up to 3 weeks. So if you've ever wondered why there's always, why spokespeople are so valuable, why you always see famous people in advertisements for clothes or cars or any of that kind of stuff, this is why. So you positively associate your feelings about the person, and the theory is that they would extend onto the car. So like book talks about a study where they market, in a control group, they would market, let's say, a clothing line with normies, with non-famous people, and then the experimental group would get marketed that same clothing line with famous people, and as they were surveyed after the fact, and the people that got the advertising with the famous people responded more positively to it. So this does work. Idea, good example here. So neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, you have like repeated pairing of products like a car with the sexually provocative image, and then the expected response, based on advertising theory, the automatic response to sexual image is arousal, and then pairing those things leads to a similar response to the product. So the idea that you could sexualize something or make something funny or just make it generally more likable would lead to more people buying what you're selling. Now, the question here is classical conditioning so powerful that it forces us to purchase items we otherwise wouldn't purchase? And, I'll let you come up with that answer on your own. Forces is kind of a weird word for me. I think, there is certainly a connection. It's tenuous at times, but research has shown that there is an effect that these things have, but our own biases and predilections definitely play into that as well. And the advertisers know that. They're trying to capitalize on our own biases and tendencies. Okay. Hold on, gotta get some water. Just in case y'all were wondering, it's very weird to just be like talking into your computer and your home office, which is largely empty besides your dog. I don't know how YouTubers do it. Okay, so before we get into operating conditioning, your book actually has a very good chart. If you have a hard copy of the book, it's on page 174. So real life examples of classical conditioning, and it gives you a good rundown here. So in like the advertising world, like we just talked about, I'm just gonna pull my book over here. The advertising world, your neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus would be repeated pairing of products such as cars with sexually provocative images. And then the expected response would be arousal, pairing that arousal with the response to the products like the car. You can also manipulate people's fears. And so like we talked about little Albert, if you've ever been out walking your dog and had a dog lunge at you, and walking by that street again, you might associate that street with that experience and then be afraid of going down that street again. Talk about people's fetishes, repeated pairings of originally non-sexual objects like shoes and sexual activity. Romance, repeated pairings of a cologne with a passionate embrace. Pet behavior, repeated pairings of an electric can opener sound after the serving of food. And then startle reaction, repeated pairings of toilet flushing with sudden rise in water temperature in the shower. So that's a good example, because like that's kind of a modern myth in many cases. That doesn't always happen, but it's been so ingrained in us through TV and movies and stuff, because it does happen. But like if you've got a good heating system, it probably won't. Okay, so let's talk about operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is sort of we talked in chapters 1 and 2 how a lot of these things come in not like pairs exactly, but sort of partnered concepts. And operant conditioning and classical conditioning are definitely two of those. So operant conditioning is learning that occurs when voluntary actions become associated with their consequences. So this is based in what we call the law of effect. The behaviors are more likely to be repeated when followed by pleasurable outcomes and less likely to be repeated when followed by unpleasant outcomes. So we call that reinforcement, either positive or negative. We'll talk about the difference between those two things in a second. But you can see this cat right here. So I think this was in Skinner's experiment. If this isn't one of Skinner's experiments, it's very similar to it. But the idea here was that they put a little snack, as you can see outside the cat cage, outside of where the cat was. And the idea was that they would try and get the cat to solve this little mechanism, and through reward, get him to do it more quickly. Okay, so this was developed by a guy named Edward Thorndike. So it's a little, like it says here, a puzzle box, and the idea that with reward, the cat would solve the puzzle faster, and it did. Okay, so B.F. Skinner, another guy, very important in this part of psychology. So this is sort of in contrast to guys like Titchener and even Freud, who were very interested in the underlying subjective structures of the brain and of psychology and how that affected behavior. So a guy like Skinner, Watson, their belief was that psychology could only be considered a true science if it restricted itself to the study of behaviors that could be seen and documented. Okay, so they were very scientifically rigorous, is what we would call that. Every thought, emotion, behavior is shaped by factors in the environment, things that you can study, things that can be observed, things that can be experimented on. So that is just a good understanding of their ideology. Now, positive reinforcement. And this can be kind of tricky to differentiate between these two things, but positive reinforcement is the process by which reinforcers are added or presented following a target behavior, increasing the likelihood of it occurring again. So if I am training Mei Mei to sit, hey Mei Mei, she's over here now. Hey dog. If I'm training Mei Mei to sit, I'm going to positively reinforce that behavior by giving her a treat. Now, positive doesn't necessarily mean good. It can also, or it doesn't mean pleasant. It just means something has been added. So if she, so like a few minutes ago before I started recording, she kind of snapped at the cat because he was invading her space. We had to have a little conversation about that. That's, that was also positive reinforcement because I'm adding my chastising of her in response to that behavior. Whereas a negative reinforcement, the removal of an unpleasant stimulus is following target behavior, increases the likelihood of it occurring again. Okay, so in that case, we are talking about something like if you've ever been in your car and before you put your seatbelt on, you get that really annoying beeping sound. And so that behavior of not having your seatbelt on is being negatively reinforced by the beeping sound. You want that beeping sound to stop, so you will put your seatbelt on. Okay, so you're doing something that is positive, but you are negatively reinforcing because you are taking away something unpleasant. So in the case of like headache medicine, if you were trying to get a headache to stop, you are negatively reinforcing by taking that pill. So again, something positive is happening, but it's being used through negative reinforcement. So another, we're going to talk about punishment a little bit later too. There's like positive punishment, negative punishment. Negative reinforcement would be like, taking away somebody's license, because that, oh wait, no, that's backwards. That's right. Yeah. You take away somebody's license. Positive reinforcements would be giving them a ticket. So you can kind of see how those two things work. Those are probably the two most confusing definitions for me, just because like many people, I think, if you say positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, it sounds like, reward and punishment, not the same thing. Similar, related, not the same thing. All right, so we do have multiple categories of reinforcers. Your primary reinforcer satisfies a biological need, so like food, water, physical contact, but a secondary reinforcer is sort of a gateway to those things. So this is here, reinforcers that do not satisfy biological needs, but often gain power through their association with primary reinforcers. So like money, I need money to buy food, to pay my rent so I can live in my house. So that is a secondary reinforcer. So the question here is, are trophies primary or secondary reinforcers? I would argue that they are secondary reinforcers because they don't satisfy a biological need, but our biological need of like belonging, they are sort of a pathway or gateway to. Okay, successive approximations. This is where it gets a little vocabby. I apologize, but successive approximations, you can sort of see it on the chart here. A method that uses reinforcers to condition a series of small steps that gradually approach the target behavior. Okay, so a while back, and we're still working on this, we were trying to teach Mei Mei to roll over, and she doesn't just like do it on her own. So like through that, you kind of have to get her to sit, you have to get her to lay down, and then roll over, and like she'll tip over, but she won't like complete the roll. So the idea with a successive approximation is that you would continue to reward whatever you're trying to get the animal or person to do, the closer they get to it. So you can see, and your book talks about the IQ Zoo and like how it's this couple, they did all these experiments on animals and trying to figure out what all they could do. So you can see these two pigeons playing tennis. So the pigeons don't play tennis out in the wild, obviously. It took a while for them to, get these birds to do this highly unusual activity. But there were, like it says here, you can see on this chart, there were several steps that they had to sort of like checkpoints they had to cross to get them to get to that, higher order function. And they got rewarded at each one of those checkpoints. So that is successful approximation. So like reinforces at every step of the way, gradually approaching a target behavior, especially if it's a complicated behavior. Shaping, which is similar, is a process by which a person observes the behaviors of another organism, providing reinforcers that the organism performs at required level. So both of those things are used to work up to a behavior that you want someone to do. All right, so this is the couple I was talking about. There are limits to operant conditioning, which are overridden by what we call instinctive drift. So they had this elaborate apparatus to where they were trying to get a chicken to like pull on a lever, and that would swing a baseball bat, and then they would have the chicken run around the bases. But and they would have like food at the each individual base, but turns out the chicken really just wanted the food. And this is the tendency for animals to revert to instinctual behaviors after a behavior pattern has been learned. So even if you, so let's say I'm out, I'm trying to teach May to not like freak out every time she sees a dog on a walk. I can do that. But like at a certain point, her instincts are going to take over, and there's only so much that I can teach her, and if another dog comes up and like tries to attack her or something, like she's going to revert to her instincts, which, is good at a certain point, but it's just the idea that, animal instinct is going to take over, and there is a limit to what we can teach, and that includes us. So talking about, this is the musical bunny. I'm just going to read this part out from your book. It says Keller and Marion Breland, who are these two folks over here. Observed one of their animal performers at the IQ Zoo in Hot Springs, Arkansas, circa 1960. Using the operant conditioning concepts they learned from B.F. Skinner, the Brelands trained ducks to play guitars, raccoons to shoot basketballs, and chickens to tell fortunes. But their animal students did not always cooperate. Sometimes their instincts interfered with the conditioning process. And that is the idea of instinctive drift. So they can't play baseball, but they can play the piano. It's kind of cool. All right, continuous reinforcement. Okay, so this is an important concept, and I'll just explain the terms first, and then kind of give you a more general explanation of like how this kind of idea gets applied. All right, continuous reinforcement is scheduled reinforcement in which every target behavior is reinforced. Very effective in establishing a behavior. Now, partial reinforcement, scheduled reinforcement in which target behaviors are reinforced intermittently. So not, like it says here, not continuously. Behaviors acquired through intermittent reinforcement to be more resistant to extinction than those acquired through continuous reinforcement. So example, when I taught May how to sit, the first few times we got her to do it, she got a treat every time. And that's continuous reinforcement. Every time her butt hits the floor, she gets a treat. So she can start to, build that association, keep working those reps through to where that association is strong. Now, if that were to continue forever, the likelihood, if I just stopped giving her the treats altogether, that association would become extinct is a lot higher than if I use partial reinforcement, which is, every couple times she would sit down, she'd get a treat, which ended up being what we did. And then that behavior, like it says here, they are more resistant to extinction because they have slowly but surely, wean themselves away from that direct association between the treat and sitting down. And humans are the same way. Okay, so this is, let's see. Yeah, okay. So fixed ratio schedule and variable ratio schedule. So fixed ratio schedule in which the subject must exhibit predetermined number of desired behaviors before a reinforcer is given, and then produces a high response rate with a predictable dip in behavior immediately predicting or preceding the reinforcer. So let's say I told you guys I was going to give you extra credit if you showed up every third class. Everybody's going to be showing up that every third class. The difference is that, the first and the second class are not always going to be as well attended because they know that reward isn't coming. That is the basic idea behind a fixed ratio schedule. The performance tends to improve as you get closer to the number that of the ratio. So like it says here, there's a predictable dip in behavior immediately preceding and after the reinforcer. Whereas a variable ratio schedule, so if I told you that, I'm going to give you extra credit, 5 times over the course of the semester, but didn't tell you when, you'd be a lot more likely to show up because there was a chance that you would get it, but you didn't know when it was going to happen. So that's a schedule in which the number of desired behaviors that must occur before a reinforcer is given changes across trials and is based on an average number of behaviors to be reinforced. That produces a much higher response rate, and that behavior is difficult to extinguish, because there's always a chance that reinforcer is going to be given. So even if, I told you you're going to get 5 over the course of the semester, you don't know when it's coming, but the likelihood of your participation in that behavior is going to be significantly higher. So fixed interval schedule in which the reinforcer comes after the pre-established interval of time. Behavior is only reinforced after the given interval is over. So in this case, think about if you study for an hour, you say, okay, after an hour of studying, I'm going to go play video games for 20 minutes. Behavior tends to increase as each time interval comes to an end. So you are rewarding yourself. And then the variable interval schedule is similar to the ratio schedule in which a behavior is reinforced after an interval of time, but the length of the interval changes from trial to trial. So if you said, I'm going to reward myself with 20 minutes of video games after 3 hours of studying. So that's still kind of the same concept there. Like if you vary either the ratio or the time, your participation is more likely to be more consistent, just because we're kind of wired that way. Okay, this is another graph that shows partial schedules of reinforcement. Then we're going to talk about punishment real quick, and then we will be done. All right, so punishment, application of a consequence that decreases the likelihood of the behavior occurring. There's a question as to, is this positive or negative reinforcement? Depends on the punishment. So a positive punishment is something aversive or disagreeable is applied following a certain behavior, and then a negative punishment is taking away something pleasant or valuable following a certain behavior. So my kid acts up, I take away I'll just say their phone. This would be if my teenager acts up, I take away their phone. Whereas if I were to, ground them, something aversive or disagreeable is applied following certain behaviors. That's positive punishment. And there's sort of like an active versus passive element to this too. Like you're doing something, like it says here, you're applying something and you're taking away something. That's basically the circle of punishment, the circle of reinforcement there. I don't know what this poor girl did, but she doesn't look very happy about it. Okay, and then there's this case study about spanking, which we will talk about next time we have class. Okay. All right, that is it for lecture time. Your test is due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night, as are all of your learning curve assignments. I think there are 8 of those in total, so 4 per chapter. If you have any questions about the test, about the learning curves, about getting everything in where it's supposed to go, when it needs to be there, please just let me know, send me an email. I will try and get back to you as quickly as possible. The best time to do that would probably be tomorrow because I'm off and I'll be able to get back with you pretty quickly. Saturday, Sunday, also probably fine. Alabama plays on Saturday night. That's the only time I will not respond. But yeah, if you have any questions, just get in touch with me. And otherwise, I will see you guys on Tuesday.